This episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 24th of October 2023 at home in Wicklow. And it is an episode that is largely focused on the things we don't say, the things we cannot say, and the resulting tension, the resulting hurt that comes from that. And for most of the episode, I'm focusing on the interpersonal. I'm focusing on the internal landscape. I'm focusing on relationships and the idea of dislocation and ecosystems within relationships and changing geography and landscapes of relationships. And again, the negative consequences of that. And I finished the episode looking at what can't be said on the international platform, particularly specifically in relation to what's playing out in Israel and Gaza, and the reluctance of so many major players in the international scene to condemn what Israel are doing in Gaza. And I explore that with a little bit of nuance, I hope, because it's a concern, and there are dire consequences in that area when stronger voices are not being heard and are not being allowed to speak. And I'm sort of fascinated by that. Okay, so that's what's coming up. I hope that sounds like it's of interest to you. And I'll see you there around the corner. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind. Leaving the dream behind. Keep my emoji inside.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. Good to have you. Good to have you here. Thanks for choosing me. Thanks for choosing this podcast above all others. If you're a return visitor, welcome back. A return listener, and if it's your first time, you're very welcome indeed. Thank you for entering this space, this zone, this area of contemplation, reflection, dissertation, and other things. I'm just back from a walk in the woods with Pepper the dog. There's been a lot of rain here. I guess connected to Storm Babette. Not Babette, but Babette, I think is what I read. Different parts of the country were blasted. So, yeah, just a bit of a wet spell in general. But there was a brief reprieve there, so I had a walk in the woods, the wet woods, a lot of water-logged parts of the path and water running along the ground down the hill in the woods. But kind of lovely. A little bit of daylight breaking through, a little bit of blue sky. And of course, as previously reported, it is autumn. It is the fall. And the leaves are really starting to show off their colours. And it's just gorgeous. So that was nice. Nice to go into the woods and smell that post-rain air, to inhale that post-rain air. It's a particular class of freshness. It has an almost sweetness to it, is how I feel about it. And I thought it'd be a good idea just to have a stroll and take in some of that fresh air in that window before sitting down here to do what I do on this thing that I often refer to as the tell, because it's not a show, it's a tell. And today the telling is connected to speaking. So they're related, aren't they? I'm telling you, they're related. I'm just trying to think if there's any other business before I get to the matter at hand. Probably not. The Rugby World Cup is finally making its way to the natural end point, which is going to feature two Southern Hemisphere behemoths. The All Blacks, who vanquished broken-hearted Ireland last week. By the time this comes out, we're talking a week and a half ago. They rolled over a very feeble Argentina on Friday night in a non-event, a non-contest. And South Africa stepped into an absolute brawl against England on Saturday night, and England brought a ferocity that they had not hinted they were capable of, and gave South Africa a real fright before South Africa ultimately triumphed thanks to their scrum. The scrum. It's a good word, isn't it? Scrum. I like that word. Scrum. What do you do? I'm a scrummager. A scrummager? Can I have a scrummage in your drawers? That's a rummager. Scrummaging. Scrummage. Scrum. Good words. Anyway, and it's hard to refer to the scrum in rugby union without adding the clause, the dark arts of the scrum, because it seems to be a mystery to anyone but scrummagers. Those very big men, and I presume, I don't watch the women's rugby game, but presumably big women in the women's game. It's a very particular skill set. It's this particularly muscular and brutal and highly pressurized clash that happens in the world of physics, and angles and distribution of weight and angle of pressure all play key roles, and you're bound up with 7 others, all locked into this heaving entity of grunt and gristle and bloody mindedness. The pressure those players must be under physically, around their necks and shoulders and backs. Oh my goodness. And we just watch in awe and wait to see what's going to happen. Will the ball come out, or will the referee, as he did on Saturday night, will he raise his hand and go penalty because your scrum was not good, your scrum was bad, and this scrum was good, and they get a penalty? And that was the penalty that ultimately won South Africa the game, thanks to an enormous cold-blooded winning kick from Andre Pollard, a 49-metre kick between the posts. It's very impressive. And I'm not going to lie, I was very relieved. I did not want to see England get through, even though I had great unambiguous admiration for their efforts on Saturday night. They absolutely brought it when it mattered. But again, they benefited from a pretty easy draw. They had loads left in the tank and horrible wet conditions, and South Africa were rattled and couldn't execute their game plan. But they found a way, as winning teams do. So anyway, there you go. That's the rugby bulletin. Let's wait and see what happens in the final on Saturday night. I have no sense of... I feel either team could win it, depending on which way the wind blows. But yeah, hopefully it's a contest worthy of a World Cup final. That's thrown up some pretty big games, and Ireland were involved in 2 absolute classics against South Africa and New Zealand. South Africa were involved in 2 already themselves, well 3 now themselves, because against us and against France and now against England. They've had a tougher road. So the All Blacks have had an easier road. Let's see if that comes into play. I don't know. It's fascinating, that stuff. Oh, I did have one final thought for those of you who care about these things. I was thinking about the game between New Zealand and Ireland 2 weekends ago, and it was bizarre upon reflection to come to the conclusion that in that game, New Zealand were bringing all the energy of underdogs. They were bringing all the energy of being underrated and being maligned and invigorated and incensed and motivated by being underrated. And it occurred to me that how they played against us was how we played for many, many years anytime we played England. And like England being the old enemy, the occupying force, the great bully boys of our history. And we would tear into those games with a tremendous ferocity, sometimes against the odds, just because of the niggle, just because of the history, just because of that relationship. And yeah, in the middle of last week, I was like, oh, yeah, right. That's the Kiwis came to us with that attitude. Like we had somehow become their oppressors, only in the rugby sense. And they came with such thirst for revenge. And it served them really well because it gave them that advantage that we struggled to overcome on the scoreboard. And ultimately we were chasing the game for the rest of the match. And we, in our innocence, in our purity of heart, thought our rugby, having been good enough, would be good enough again without the extra motivation of grudge, without the extra motivation of we have been slighted, we have been insulted. And yeah, it's kind of interesting, I think, from a psychological point of view, that it's good to feel you've got something to prove. If you can channel that and marshal that and apply it with a precise and incisive strategy in on the field of battle. Yeah, interesting. I mean, if you take that across to martial arts, I mean, I tried to stay in this place of non-emotionality, access a desire to compete. I try to access a sort of a fieriness and a commitment to battle, but that's not the same as being emotional, or feeling, and I know the difference because, a couple of times over many years of training, I'd find myself, I'm actually angry now. And you could see the kind of the dynamic change and the look in the opponent's eyes. And that's not the place to be. It's not the place to be. And I witnessed it many times as an instructor or training with other people. And that is not, that's kind of antithetical, in the world of traditional martial arts. It's control that and channel that energy into better karate, better application of technique, better strategizing, better management of the exchange. Okay, anyway, there you go. So anything else? I'm not sure. Nothing is jumping in my head, but a couple of things have come up, and this is what I want to talk about today. I said I want to talk about something to do with speaking, and I'm not talking about public speaking. I am talking about speaking as a form of essential communication. If you want to use the phrase speaking one's truth, I guess that's applicable here. Although, as always, when these phrases kind of come into the general vernacular, they lose a bit of their impact, and they can just get a bit hollowed out. But a couple of things came up last week. One was a conversation with a friend who has found himself at odds with many of his family members, his siblings, and it's been a sort of an ongoing experience of estrangement and conflict and hurt, and probably misconstrual, confusion, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and it's been going on for quite a long time. And he found himself with an opportunity to speak to a psychologist, and the psychologist was very sympathetic to his position and felt he was doing as well as he could under the circumstances, and that there was a very large chance his family members actually had a lot of admiration for him and really valued the path he has walked in his life and the type of person he's become and the role he's played in the family. And I thought that was interesting because it's, it's something I recognise within my own family, the permission given by family members to allow you to be in a certain role, and when you try to change your role in the family, there's often a lot of resistance because it's a threat to the ecosystem of the family. But it seems to me that within that tension of we don't want you to be that way, we want you to be this way, and this thing that you're doing is challenging our sense of stability and our sense of what we can manage or cope with or understand within years and years and years of established dynamics. So stop. Don't change anything now because, just stay where you're meant to be. And while I kind of understand that as an idea, and I understand and I recognize it as an experienced dynamic, as I've had experience of that in certain areas of my life with my own siblings and family. What I came away with, having heard this account from my friend, was the things that are unsaid and the convictions that go unspoken, uncommunicated, that remain sort of locked in a much deeper place. And I mean, I've spoken before about the concept of hexeity, the idea of, hexeity describes the thing in you, the quality in you that makes you you, that makes one. So it's your defining, identifying kind of characteristic or trait, your essence, if you will. And I've argued in previous episodes of the podcast that I like to think of that idea as something that is a deep truth that lives within us and a deep understanding of self that lives within us. And a lot of the time we're aware of that, not in an explicit way, but in a sort of a subconscious way, a sort of an energy that we hold, a rumbling that we feel within, that we often don't feel at all comfortable engaging with, or looking in the eye, or uncovering and bringing to the fore. And yet we know it's there, like deep down, we know there's this all-seeing, all-knowing, all-feeling truth within us that knows us intimately, that knows us better than anyone else could ever possibly know us. And I like to frame that conviction or belief in benign terms, rather than making it something to be fearful of, rather than making it something that's ominous, to regard it more as something that is a presence within us, or a sense of understanding within us that is watchful, mindful, non-judgmental, non-interfering, but always has our best interests at heart, wants us to do well ultimately. And if I if I tether that to the idea, or the, you know, the cliche, the truism of, you know, the truth will set you free, it's because I believe in that. You know, on a deep level, I believe that ultimately the removal of layers, of protection, of obfuscation, of the removal of different poses or shapes or faces that we present to the world or adopt to help us negotiate the day-to-day, you know, demands of life. I think once we strip all that stuff away, we get down to our base state, which is where we really live, I believe. It's very, I mean, I come back to this again and again in one form or another. I reiterate this conviction that I have, that everything is being driven by this base state, these convictions that we have about ourselves, on a deep unspoken level. And it's, if you're open to that idea, if you believe, you might not articulate it the same way as me, but if you essentially go, yeah, that feels kind of right, and then stop and go, well, it's really, and you know, if you stop and then acknowledge that it's really difficult to engage with that, it's really difficult to comprehend that, it's really difficult to unpack that, and the art of revealing ourselves to ourselves is tremendously difficult, for many reasons, and it is because of the complexity of our personalities, the complexity of how we evolve, the complexity of how we interact with others, the complexity of who is in our lives, the impact they have on us, the complexity of how we negotiate on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis, how we negotiate the hand we've been dealt, how we continue to strive, to adapt, to compromise, how we continue to yearn, how we continue to ache, to hurt, and how we continue to just try and blunder our way through. That all is tantamount to making us complex and nuanced and many layered individuals. And sometimes the difficulty lies in the very mundane reality of the busyness of our lives and the very many other demands that are made of us, and to try and find time or make time or find the professional space, find the peaceful reflective solitude, to find the energy, the desire, the will to lift the lid, to sit down and start rearranging the warehouse, to look up and see hundreds of thousands of boxes and go, one of these boxes contains my truth. But they all look identical, and it's like, well, where do I begin? Where is it? Is it this one here at the front, on the bottom? Is it at the top? Is it at the back? Is it in the middle? And as I say, like, sometimes just the day-to-day demands of living preclude the luxury of headspace, the luxury of energy being right, which I'm a big believer in. I'm a big believer in the energy's right, the energy's wrong. How am I feeling? What do I have the capacity for? And, stress stress and the frantic mind and, so many different things just pull us away from that calmness and confidence that can feed our sense of resolve, our sense of resilience, and give us the emotional confidence to ally with a determination to do the work. And again, that's one of those phrases: do the work on oneself. If and again, you might be sitting there, you might be, whatever you're doing, you might be listening and going, I don't need to do the work, I'm great. What are you talking about? I'm absolutely fine, life's good, I don't have any itch I need to scratch. And I have to put my hand up and go, well, maybe this is just my obsession, and this is absolutely solipsistic and self-centered. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I'm saying that like genuinely, sincerely. I recognize where my interests lie, and I understand that is very much connected to my own sense of self, my own lived experience, my the frame that I so often drop on my interpersonal relationships, on the people I care about, my friendships, family members, my wife, my daughter, myself, the frame I drop on how I interact with the rest of the world. It all comes back to this place of understanding and sort of carving away at this rock to, in the attempt to reveal more, in the attempt to get to something that's irreducible. And and that's a through line in a lot of my thinking, in a lot of the the episodes of the podcast historically, the think pieces I used to write on my blog before I launched the podcast. And very little happens to me that makes me deviate from those convictions and those interests. And when I get most stressed is when I travel furthest from those convictions. It's when I'm forced by life to change my orientation and look in very different corners of the room because of external requirements, external demands, external contingencies, external realities. And I get very bristly and resentful, and that that creates a tension. It creates a tension in me. I know that that's an ongoing tension within my marriage, because I know my wife would view that frame and how I talk about it as a reluctance to step into the world of real grown-up decisions and regular jobs that we don't love to do, and that type of compromise. And I don't invalidate that position, but my wife has a particular viewpoint based on her experiences, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. So we view problem solving very differently, and that's a battle that continues to be a battle for us, and has caused us a lot of stress in our relationship, and definitely informed times of really intense sort of alienation and estrangement and hurt. And so then I circle back to the starting point of this, which comes back to what truths can be spoken, what can be said. And I think with long relationships, whether it's sibling relationships, family relationships, long, deep friendships, romantic relationships, romantic partnerships, there's an I'm not sure what the phrase is here or how I want to describe it, but there's a cost. There's a cost to longevity. There's a cost to a relationship lasting for a long time. Because the relationship continues to shift and move and twist and deviate from what it once was. And I think there's a strange dislocation that can happen within lifelong relationships. I think there's an understanding and a recognition that, okay, this is a lifelong relationship. This is an attachment or a tethering or an adhesion that isn't probably going to be undone, that isn't going to be cleaved apart. There's a sense of, if these words sound negative, they're not meant to, but a sense of resignation, fatalism, inevitability, unstoppability, and that can bring a sense of fatigue. That can bring a sense of defeat. That can bring, I think, real complacency. And this idea goes all the way back to the first episode of the podcast, because that complacency, I think, is where a lot of damage can be done. That sort of idea of taking the other for granted, working constantly with the assumption that they're not going anywhere, they'll still be here in a year, so I don't actually have to say anything. And I hate that personally. I can't stand it. But that doesn't mean there's an easy solution to it. And see, when I mentioned that idea of dislocation, it's an opting out. That's how I think of it. Whether conscious or not, there's a sort of a stepping out of the slipstream of the relationship and just going, I'm just going to be here by myself doing my own thing. And we do that. I've done it. I do it. We do that because it's too difficult to do the work to keep things in a place that is optimal, in a place that is more fully functional, more fully thriving, more more emotionally and communicatively healthy. And inevitably, because we've opted out, there's a separation if the other person keeps going, or if they're kind of deviating on another path within this relationship that's always there. And I think then what happens is with that dislocation becomes a changed geography within the relationship. And changed geography means changed landscapes. It means changed perspectives, changed viewing points, changed orientation. And suddenly a relationship that was quite aligned and moving along the same sort of track and enjoying the same moments is really living in two very different spaces. And I've made this argument before, the idea of sort of reference points, the idea of orientation, the idea of that sort of geography of the ecosystem of a relationship being a very real part of how a relationship can function well or not well. And so I think what happens is then people, as they kind of forge a new ecosystem or carve out a little different corner of the ecosystem within the relationship, there's a sort of a fulminating process and a ruminating process, again, that happens consciously or not, but things build, and the undemonstrated builds, the unspoken builds. And I think that's where a lot of hurt and resentment and judgment thrive. They thrive in that isolation. They thrive in that separation. And the sort of the stockpiling of those things, the stockpiling of hurt, of resentment, of judgment, the turning of the valve higher to a greater sense of again, for the third time I'm using these words, the greater sense of alienation, of estrangement, of distancing, makes strangers of us. And I think it can happen anywhere. I think it can happen to anyone. I think it can happen to any relationship. And I think it's very painful. I think it's very, very painful and very... it's very destructive. It's very instructive to, I think, our sense of internal wellness, because we carry a wound and we carry a sense of hurt, but we're not talking about it. So it's just this very distinctly unwell part of ourselves that ends up being neglected, and the demands of life and the demands of the relationship, they continue, and we just we just soldier on, whoever we are, we get on with things, and it's like life accelerates us past these moments, and the more of these little, these departures from the track, the more of these experiences of dislocation occur along the way, even though there will be comings together, I think, intermittently and in an ongoing way. There's an accumulation of the sense of wound, and an accumulation of the sense of being unheard or misunderstood. And when you throw that into the mix of the complexity of self and this layering that we do, where we're I think many of us are just doing our best. That's my conviction. Apart from the true psychopaths and sociopaths in the world, most of us sit in a reasonable section of the spectrum and are functioning as best we can and doing our best and have reasonably good intentions. And I think what a lot of us do is we, and this is such a human trait, I think, our adaptability, and our adaptability is such a important an important aspect of how we survive, and how humans have always survived. Our incredible adaptability, and how we adapt to the worst scenarios and the worst situations, and our ability to endure, and our ability to absorb. And I know that there's a huge scale in which to drop that idea, a huge scale of what anyone may or may not experience in their lives. But it is, I think, a defining characteristic of what it is to be human. The survival instinct, the survival impulse, what we'll do to make it through another night, to get to another dawn. And within a reasonable scale of experience, we can call that resilience. And if we step into that wellness sphere, and how we mind ourselves and self-care, I'm a huge fan of the idea of resilience. I'm a huge fan of that idea of having a certain amount of toughness and a certain amount of courage to face into difficult things, because I do think it serves us, and I do think there's huge learning in facing difficult times, difficult events, and facing difficult aspects of ourselves. The risk, of course, is when resilience becomes an armor that we don't know how to take off, and then it's very hard to be open, and very hard to be vulnerable, and very hard to be soft. And that, arguably that may be more true of men than women. I'm not sure, but I don't really think so. Again, we all have our different coping mechanisms, and most of those coping mechanisms are a way of self-protecting. They're a way of deflecting, and they're a way of sort of turning our wound away from the spiky parts of life, because we don't want to be pricked there, if you'll forgive the phrase. And so we hold ourselves in a particular way. We turn ourselves in a different way. We orientate ourselves in a different way. And part of that orientation, part of that self-protection, part of that self-preservation, often, I think, comes back to this idea of, I just can't say, I can't express this sense of whatever it is I'm feeling. I can't express this. I can't speak about it. It's too monstrous. It's too mountainous. It's too huge. It's become too powerful. And it's just so difficult to strip back all the stuff and go, I feel like this because of this. And to really strip it down to, I feel afraid, I feel hurt, I feel rejected, I feel really angry, and I'm angry because that hurt. I'm angry because I'm scared, and I don't like feeling scared, and feeling scared makes me angry. And I wasn't intending to. I wasn't intending there to represent my own state, but there are definitely elements of truth in that. And my negotiation of my own anger has been a theme that I've spoken about fairly regularly at different times on the podcast. And I know my anger is connected to those. My anger is connected to fear of failure. My anger is connected to fear of being rejected, fear of the loss of love, fear of just being inadequate, fear of not being able to punch through the mess of life with something valuable that is an expression of what I care about and who I am. I know that, and I feel that that's what my anger is connected to. And I try to deal with that, and by doing things like this podcast, and investigating and examining my own mental state, my own emotional state. Really examining my own behavior. I'm always interested in areas of weakness, of areas where I feel I'm failing or not doing as well as I might. I'm interested in understanding them rather than judging them, so I have a chance to do better, so I'll be better for the other people in my life, better for myself. And that's I think that is a really important part of the discussion. If I just digress for a moment and talk about anger, because I had a conversation with a good friend, just in the last 24 hours, and he was talking about his son, smashing something, his teenage son, and I was just saying, yeah, I really recognise that behaviour with my own history of how I've expressed my anger at different times, and lashing out and smashing things and punching walls and punching myself when I'm really frustrated. And I was just talking to my friend about the idea of the importance of finding compassion for ourselves and finding that place where we can sort of embrace ourselves and calm ourselves and go, turn that parental love on ourselves and go, I know you're hurting, I know you're upset, I know you're angry, and that's okay, because I never want to invalidate anger as an emotional expression of something important. Like it comes from somewhere, and that's always where my interest ultimately goes. Even though when I get angry, I can feel like I'm failing, I can feel very judgmental about myself, and especially when it's impacting my daughter, when it's impacting my wife, particularly those two, because they'd be witness to it more than others. It's not a feeling I enjoy, but sometimes it's easier to go, oh well, I'm angry and I'm sorry I got angry. That's easier than going, where's this really coming from? And see, then it comes back to, what am I, what's not being spoken, what's not being said, what's left unexamined, what's just beyond reach in terms of where my spotlight is turned. It's the it's the escapee from prison, just hiding over in the corner where the spotlight can't reach, the searchlight can't reach, and that's another way to think of it. The thing that's trapped, the thing that's imprisoned and wants to escape but doesn't want to be seen, and there's a tension there within us, and to step back to the original thread here of the difficulty of speaking, the difficulty of saying what's really going on. I'm hurt, I'm angry, I'm frustrated with you because I feel threatened by this behaviour, and it makes me question myself, for example. And yeah, it's interesting to move away, from the general and the interpersonal, and to move over to, it may seem like a strange thing to look at in this context, but with this conflict that's playing out at the moment in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza, and the the eruption of the eruption of controversy and divided opinion around how the international community is reacting to this, and also the reaction of different Jewish communities around the world. It's really interesting because there is something that is very connected to what I'm talking about, very connected to this idea of what is not being said, what is unspoken, and what people are really uncomfortable speaking about or saying. And that is that Israel are committing war crimes. They are guilty of collective punishment in Gaza, and there are very, very few critical voices in the international community who are condemning this and going, this is not acceptable. And I read an article the other day which was basically about the reaction of different Jewish communities in England and how they are struggling with what they feel comfortable saying, how they are struggling with coming out and being critical of Israel's aggression and their response to the attack in Israel on October the 7th by Hamas, which was a horrible terrorist attack that resulted in a huge loss of life, and that's not really a grey area for me. I mean, I hesitated to speak about it a couple of episodes ago. Terrorism, acts of terrorism, bombings, mass shootings, are horrible. They're repellent. They really are just this horrible expression of hatred. They're a repulsive expression of political convictions. And it's one thing when the victims of terrorism are, what the IRA used to call legitimate targets. The Irish Republican Army used to call legitimate targets. If you're talking about other military operatives, if you're talking about political figures, I can accommodate that with greater comfort. I can kind of go, well, that makes sense, because that's an instrument of oppression. That's an instrument of the occupying state. That's an instrument of the enemy, and the enemy understands that we're at war. But I've never rejoiced in the death of anyone that's come at the hands of a terrorist organization, even if I feel the political motivation behind the act of terrorism is legitimate. And so I think there's a legitimacy to organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like, I felt like the IRA had a legitimacy. But I don't struggle to go, I don't think you should be blowing people up. I don't think you should be machine gunning people attending a concert. That's not a grey area for me. And similarly, I don't have any problem condemning Israel's disproportionate response. I don't have any issue condemning Israel's prolonged, 56-year occupation of Gaza, the ongoing aggressive stance of Israel in occupying land, and I condemn an international community that has stayed silent for so long. But this is something, and this is what I took away from that article that I read, just reading the very, reading different representatives from different Jewish bodies or groups in England, and clearly they're afraid to speak as well. They're afraid to come out and go, we don't approve of this. This doesn't represent our values. It doesn't represent who we are as a people. And of course, let's just recognize very quickly, there is no monolithic Jewish identity. There are lots of different expressions of Jewish identity, of ways to live with, Judaism, and I think many of them are a million miles from Israeli military aggression. And again, Israel has been for 14 years under the leadership of an extremely hawkish leader in Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's, if you kind of draw back and go, like, the idea that Israeli intelligence didn't know about the attack that was planned by Hamas is hard to believe, and it's conceivable, I think, that Israel would have, Israeli intelligence would have notified the government, and the government may have gone, let's let this happen, and that will give us the excuse we've been waiting for, to go in and destroy Gaza and attack really hard with our with our military might, and definitively clean house, so to speak. That's conceivable, isn't it? And I mean, it's a dirty war. But I must say, I did feel, and I do feel, that there's a parallel here with the attack on October 7th in Israel. There's a parallel between that and the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in 2001. Because I feel that this is a case of, Israel's reaction and their sense of, this is an unprecedented atrocity. Similarly, in America in 2001, that was an unprecedented terrorist attack on American soil. But there was a sense of, I certainly had a sense of, the slapper being slapped, the bully being struck back, and America's long history of interventionist, imperialist politics and dirty wars in different parts of the world, serving their own interests, and the deaths that resulted, the civilian deaths that resulted because of their politics and interference in different regimes around the world, in Central and South America particularly, I would argue. I would draw a parallel between that and Israel's aggressive occupation and stance historically, in relation to Gaza and the West Bank, and I'm struck by how there hasn't been the same sort of outcry for atrocities committed by Israeli military offensives or American military offensives over the years. But suddenly, and I think this was such a wrong-headed move by Ursula von der Leyen at the EU to run up Israeli flags after the October 7th attack. It's like, no, this is not the position to be taking. And if you're going to run up Israeli flags, you better start running up Palestinian flags as well, and condemn, support the victims on both sides of this conflict. And to draw this back to what is not allowed to be said, again, from that article, it was clear that in those Jewish communities, there were people going, I can't, there's a reluctance or an inability to come out and speak. And it's all about the fear of recrimination. And in the last week, an Irish businessman, Paddy Cosgrave, who was the CEO of a company called Web Summit, a very successful tech group. He came out and took a position that was very clear, and he was like, these are war crimes that Israel is guilty of. They need to be condemned in very clear terms, even if they are allies. War crimes are war crimes. And I feel that's a very reasonable thing to say. And if I'm critical of Israel, and I think if anybody's critical of Israel, being critical of Israel is not anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean you're discriminating against Jews. I reject that idea completely. But Paddy Cosgrave has had to step down from that role, and lots of high-profile companies, tech companies and celebrities withdrew their support from Web Summit. They had some big event coming up in the next few weeks, and they've all gone, nah, we're not on board anymore. And I find that extraordinary. I find it extraordinary that people can't stand up and have moral convictions and keep them, separate from their business practices. Now, as I say, I'm not saying that I'm shocked. I'm not shocked as such, but you're like, what the hell? How is this something that is not allowed to be said? How is Israel so protected? How does Israel exert so much power that if somebody is critical of what they're doing, that it can cost them their job, and it can cost them endorsements, and it can cost them the support of the highest profile organizations in the world. Because I don't think condemning what Israel is doing in Gaza, I don't think that's a controversial position. And I don't think condemning Hamas and that act of terrorism is controversial either. But again, we're in this area of the unspoken, and what's allowed to be said and what's not allowed to be said. And I detest this because in the world of politics, it's so deeply cynical, it's so deeply dishonest, it's so deeply immoral and unethical, and I just despise that, because I think there's such moral cowardice. I mean, deplorable moral cowardice in being silent. It's I just find it despicable. And politics, of course, is all about hedging. It's all about the preserving self-interest, and it's about power. It's about money. It's about allegiances, and it really it shows us the worst of ourselves, unfortunately. And I mean, now more than ever, we need greater political courage and moral courage in the world, when we're living in such a fractured we're living in such a fractured world at the moment, and if this is just another flashpoint to indicate the kind of venality and corruption and cowardice of major power players in the world, you just kind of throw your hands up and go, what the hell is wrong with people? Who raised... It's so funny, isn't it? I come back and I think, who raised these people? Who were their parents? These leaders of these companies and of countries who can't come out and go, this is just wrong. I'm sorry, it's wrong. And Yeah, I don't know. And then this is why I'm more interested in individuals, and this is why I spend so much of my time contemplating, the interior landscape, because I feel it's more workable. I feel positive results are more possible, more attainable, more likely. There's more likely to be a gratifying outcome, and that's not something anyone's ever said about the conflicts in the Middle East. And I'm just telling you, just in case there's any confusion, I have nothing but sympathy for the victims on both sides of that horrible conflict that's playing out at the moment. Nothing but sympathy for the family members who've lost people, whether in Palestine, in Gaza, or in Israel. When has this ever served anyone? But yeah, I don't know. I don't want to end on a cynical note, but there has to be. We have to get to a place, just like South Africa got to a place, just like Northern Ireland got to a place. And I did a whole episode on those post-conflict processes, truth and reconciliation, the complexity of becoming disentangled, from blood conflict, and Israel and Palestine, Hamas, Hezbollah, whatever, they all have to find a way to go, this can't go on. This cannot go on. There has to be a way to peace and cohabitation, because it's just not sustainable. There can't be any positive outcome if it's all rooted in bloodshed, hatred, enmity, revenge, punishment. That idea of, we're going to punish you, we're going to make you pay. It's when has that ever ended well? Okay, can I end this well? I just have to stop talking about that and go. I'm going to go. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, so that's it for another week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this. I hope you got something from it. I hope it turned your head in another direction, or maybe you were predisposed to looking in the same direction as me. But thanks for your time. Thank you for giving me the last 65 minutes or so. I am very grateful. And as always, if you want to throw me some love on social media, that would be lovely. And some people do. I see you people. It really does. It means a lot to me personally, because I tell you what, there are times when I feel like going, what am I doing here? Let's just pack this in. So getting that bit of support, all the links to the social media platforms are there wherever you're listening to this, and if you want to reward me for this ongoing effort, this work that I try to do on a weekly basis, which does require quite a bit of mental and emotional work to come onto this mic once a week and lay these things out before you. It does take a bit of effort, so you can support that using the Patreon link. That's patreon.com/theclearout, for the price of a coffee, a tea, a drink, a sandwich. And that is also a great endorsement of what I'm doing here, and makes me go, yeah, I'm not a complete idiot. I'm not wasting my time doing this thing. So do what you can. And if you can't do that with your hand in your pocket, just spread the word if you think this is worth sharing, and give me a review, rate the podcast. All that stuff really helps. But ultimately, if you're listening to this, that means you have listened, and I thank you for your time. Okay, stay safe, stay well, stay positive, stay resilient, mind yourselves. I'll talk to you soon. All the best. Bye.